She kissed the Blarney Stone. I must say it's wonderful to leave the high living and low thinking of Notre Dame and come down here to the low living and high thinking of Dallas, don't you think? I've been there for a year, and I was sharing earlier, it's a dream to get a fellowship there. And it's like going back to graduate school with 35 years under your belt. So you don't have to worry which essays you're going to read. You know exactly what you've got to deal with. And no politics, can you believe it? No students, no teachers, no teaching. So I'm thrilled to be back just for the weekend. I fly back actually tomorrow morning. Now I want to say up front that in terms of the progress that we've made, we're way behind schedule. And the reason for that is the recession. The folk who really want to fund our operation, Templeton Foundation, basically shut down for almost 2 years. But I'm glad to say that we made a virtue of that necessity, and I'm back now in conversation with them. And I'm hoping that within the next 3 months, we will really get the kind of funding that we need to do the work that we want to do. So I don't want to disappoint you up front in terms that I've got really new news to break on some of this. Now, what I want to do is to sort of say a bit about the background music to the project and then review the project. So those of you, I don't know that everybody knows exactly what is going on, but I'll give you my Reader's Digest version of it and say why I'm so excited about it. It's very odd for a theologian to be interested in neuroscience. Now, I'm trained, I did a joint honors degree in philosophy and psychology. I'd never mentioned the psychology until now, because I love the philosophy so much. And then I did a degree in theology, and then went off and did a doctorate in philosophy and religion. And you'd wonder, what on earth is a theologian doing, even thinking about issues in neuroscience? Now, the background music to this is the old hoary issue of the relationship between religion and science. And what's happening, actually, is we're moving into a third phase of the relationship between the two. In the early phase, the issue was cosmology. You will have, if you've got your granny's Bible, and you look at Genesis, you'll find that the date of creation was 4004 BC. I'm not joking you. And that was, I have to tell you, it was worked out by an Irishman. Who else would do it? It was a brilliant scholar in Dublin called Archbishop Usher. And what he did was he tracked back the genealogies in Genesis, just added them up and worked it out at 4004 BC, and then others added in the details Thursday, October the 31st, 9 o'clock in the morning, all that kind of stuff. Now, it was obvious that when cosmology really took off, that the conflict with theology was obvious. The second big phase was the phase on the relationship between theology and evolution. Now, that sort of lumbers on like a bad flu. Basically, I think that issue is resolved. I don't see any deep incompatibility between evolution and a God who ingeniously creates a world in which over a long space of time all this stuff emerges. We have no dog hunting in that race. It's over. You know, have a drink, take a break, and let it be. Now, on the third one, it's the development of neuroscience. Now, you might wonder, well, how would that intersect with theology under any circumstances? And I have to just spell out just a little how that is the case. Theologians and brain scientists overlap on the issue of the nature of human beings. Now, theology, the great thing about theology is it's so difficult that you can make up your own evidence as you go along. It's even better than philosophy in that respect. But theology, a really rough definition of theology, which was developed brilliantly by Aquinas, an amazing theologian, is that theology is about God and everything else insofar as it relates to God. Which means technically there's nothing off limits to what a theologian is interested in. Because you're interested in the relationship between theology and mathematics, you can be interested in the relationship between theology and the natural world. Now, the kind of stuff that Catherine was getting all uptight about, the issue of the atonement, which is an absolutely fascinating issue, namely, how does the life and death of Christ affect and the healing of the human situation? That's a wonderfully interesting question. But that's not the limit. There's a wide range of issues. Now, when it comes to human nature, there are two sets of issues that are interesting to the theologian. And the first one is, why do we have to lock our doors at night? Why do people screw up? Somebody asked me if I was going to speak in Bog Irish. Here I am. It's called the doctrine of sin, the problem of sin. We're never run out of any work because there's plenty of sin around. And so the issue on human nature is partly what's gone wrong with human beings, how can human beings be brought into right relationship with the living God, how can they overcome the alienation that exists between them and God and nature and each other. And if you come out of Ireland, you have no problem whatsoever believing in sin. It's just all over the place. Now, Americans are sort of more relaxed about it, and you sometimes become very optimistic. Now, on that issue, neuroscience, in a way, has nothing to do with it. But it can get indirectly related to that because doctrines of sin lead into doctrines of determinism. That's to say, whatever you do, you're going to sin, which means you're determined to sin. So how are you free? Now, that's a very interesting question. Luther, by the way, denied that you had any freedom whatsoever. He would not have gone on well in the United States because you all believe in freedom. You believe in freedom on steroids. But Luther basically said, you're in bondage, the will is in bondage, get over it, and there is no free will. Now, Calvin, he tried to work out a compatibilist account. I'm not going to go into any great detail, and that shows up in the philosophical literature, where at once you're fully determined and you're free, and you're free because you voluntarily do things. So you just don't sort of drift into doing things that are wrong. You dive headlong into doing things that are wrong. You do them voluntarily, but that just means that the causes are within you. Your desires, your beliefs, your wishes, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm an anti-Calvinist. This came out of my talk, I think, pretty powerfully. I think Calvinism, forgive me if I'm offending anybody, I think it's out of the pit of hell. I'm a Methodist, I'm an Arminian. I think that if you don't have freedom, we're up a creek. Well, we're not going to go there now. But you can see where issues of freedom and determinism crop up very readily when you try to think through what sin is, how grace operates, and whatnot. And in the current work I'm doing, I hope to solve, Catherine, you'll be pleased to know this, I'm going to solve the Augustinian-Pelagian controversy again. Now, here's the other issue, the way in which the other issue. Theologians are interested in what are human beings essentially. Now, you can put it in a whole host of ways, but you can put it in terms of, is there something unique about being human over against, say, being a porpoise or being a fly or being, a table? And from the beginning, theologians have insisted that human beings are made in the image of God. Now, you begin to unpack that, and there's some very interesting implications that come out of that. I'll not go into all of them. But one of them is that human beings mirror the reality of God. And central to the reality of God is that God is an agent. And that God is an extraordinary agent who creates the world out of nothing. That requires some imagination. Sustains it, just simply, so that the image of God, God himself, is conceived as this extraordinary agent. Now, that's a whole other chapter in my current research. And I'm amazed, actually, that notion has not been developed seriously within theology, although I think it's absolutely crucial to understanding the Christian vision of God, or the Jewish, or the Islamic vision of God. Now, human beings mirror the agency of God. And the core of that is a very simple idea that human agents are entities who are equipped with certain capacities and powers, which they may or may not exercise. That's where the freedom comes in. So that we are genuinely agents who can do this or do that. We can make real decisions, and we are, in a deep sense, free. Now, working all that out is an absolutely fascinating issue. Now, how does that relate to neuroscience? Well, the standard literature that's been on neuroscience for a long time has been that human beings basically are physics and chemistry. So why are we so interested in the brain? We're so interested in the brain because the brain is the mind. There's nothing over and above the physics and chemistry of the brain. So that the idea, for example, that you would survive your death, the idea that you have a soul, in fact, even the idea that you have a mind is ultimately to be reduced, to be redescribed, to be reinterpreted in terms of whatever you find out about the biochemistry and about the workings of the brain. Now, when I was trained in philosophy in the late 1960s, this was called the Australian Heresy, because it had been developed brilliantly by a network of Australian philosophers, starting with D.M. Armstrong. And in fact, this is now making the rounds again, and it's believe it or not, in a good Catholic school like Notre Dame in the philosophy department, most of them are in fact physicalists. That's to say, human beings are essentially physics and chemistry, their brains are essentially their minds, and then, of course, if you're a philosopher, you can spend a career trying to figure out, well, what do we mean by freedom? How are you going to relate that to our consciousness? That's a big, big problem. How do you relate it to the descriptions that we have about our beliefs, which don't seem to show up? I'll give you details of this if you want it later on. Don't seem to show up in descriptions of the physics and chemistry. There's a massively interesting philosophical set of questions in and around that. But what's emerged with the neuroscience is that it's given physicalism a good name. And it's tied into a wider comprehensive vision of the world, that ultimately the world simply is physics and chemistry. That's A. B, that the world is determined from one end to the other. So that any causes, it's a causally determined world, so that if you know one side of it, then the other side of it comes out. C, there's what's called the principle of the causal closure. There are no other causes above and beyond what you've got in the physics. So you can't talk about a soul or a human agent or a mind in any serious, robust sense. And then the last component of this is that effectively that's the most rational way to understand the world. Now that, of course, involves wider developments in the whole of the Western world, particularly in the development of the Enlightenment, where if you really want to know how the world functions, you've got to turn to science. And that's why, by the way, theology, it's no accident that we're off at the edge of the campus. We're the lowest of the low in the epistemological stakes. And that's a very interesting thing to experience, because at one time, theology was the queen of the sciences. In the medieval period, you know, you had to fit all of what you knew about the world from observation or elsewhere into what was available to you in theology. Now, theology is off at the edge. And of course, you know, with the whole development of new atheism, this is a big issue culturally. So that the wider cultural and even media events that get connected to all of this are just absolutely fascinating. And what it means is that if you like, the oomph behind the appeal to neuroscience in order to establish a thoroughly materialistic view of the universe, with the crown jewels being a materialistic view of human agents and human beings. That agenda is absolutely out there in spades on steroids, if I can mix my metaphors. Now, the initial way in which theologians have dealt with this is basically often what happens in theology: you jump in the ditch before you get kicked in it. I once talked to a sociologist at Oxford and said that's what theologians have been so beaten up over the last 200 or 300 years that rather than get kicked in the ditch, they jump in the ditch. Whatever's coming at them, they receive it and say, okay, we'll take it and figure out what we're going to do with it. And in fact, Templeton, who've been the big funders in all of this, from a period from about the, I would say, mid-'80s until the early beginning part of this century, they gave millions of dollars to projects which were related to a certain agenda vis-a-vis this issue. Now, recall what the issue is. Neuroscience gives you the ultimate truth about human beings with respect to minds and their brains. The theologian seems to want to say something more robust, something more substantial. So how are we going to bring these two together and actually figure out a way to still be a theologian rather than just go off and sell insurance or, you know, become a financial advisor or run TED or whatever else you're going to do? So there was a network of people, some of them out of Cambridge, happy to say not out of Oxford, out of Cambridge and California, and they got a lot of money from Templeton, basically trying to figure out how can we accept a fully physicalist account of the human agent and still be committed to a robustly Christian account of what a human agent is. The leader of this, in terms of theologians, was a wonderful theologian called Nancy Murphy. In fact, we nearly hired her at Perkins, but she tripped up on one interview and we couldn't pull it off. But she would have been a very interesting person to have. And the core of that response, I don't want to go too far into that, you can pick it up in the conversation, was we're going to accept a physicalist account of human beings. And then we're going to say that as the evolutionary process develops, there are emergent properties. There are emergent entities above and beyond simply the physics of chemistry, but still governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. And so we will treat human beings as a kind of an emergent entity above and beyond what's simply at the physics and chemistry, but keep the physics in play in terms of the deterministic laws, then work out a compatibilist, usually Calvinist account of how all these two go together, and then simply, this is very interesting Christian theological consequences, because it means that when you die, it's all over until you get to the resurrection, which, by the way, was Luther's view. Those of you who are Lutherans maybe didn't know that. But when you die with Luther's view, you quit, it's over, and then you get resurrected by a miracle at the end. And of course, the beauty of this from a Christian point of view is that it retains in a really substantial way what you might call the materialistic character of the Christian tradition. Christianity is an incredibly materialistic religion. I mean, if you believe in the incarnation, that God shows up as physics and chemistry, you've got to believe that. So God's committed to a physical universe. So they worked out a whole proposal on all of that. Now, for various reasons, there are all sorts of problems, I think, philosophically and otherwise, in that option. And that gets us to the option that I'm interested in. Now, I'll not go into all the wonderful sort of stuff that I mentioned as to how all this got going in Le Madeleine's. You run into this person, you run into that person. But the core of the issues are this. You can now do these ingenious experiments, just to review what the project involves. Ingenious experiments where you can have, on the one hand, you can begin to measure the density of focused human attention. There's a fellow called Rick Warren, who's a psychologist out of Canada, who's in Virginia, and he does very sophisticated, delicate experimental work. I get nervous about this as a theologian, how you measure the density of focused human attention. But what it means is that you can get a handle on human action and how intense our focused attention is, our mental action. And then with the MRIs, you can track what happens in the brain. So what you can begin to see then is that, in fact, and this is the core claim of the experiments that we're interested in, and that some have been done, and we will commission them as soon as we get the funding. What they're interested in is, let's see what difference focused human attention makes, if you like, to the biochemistry of the brain. Now, some of you know this as a matter of common sense. That actually, how we attend to things, our own psychological welfare, actually affects the very biochemistry and physics of the brain. That's an amazing claim, actually. But we've not had any way of getting at that experimentally. And that's what's at stake here. And the chap who's really been a pioneer on this is a man called Jeffrey Schwartz, who is the research psychiatrist at the University of UCLA, who was the one who discovered the sections of the brain related to OCD. Now, I'm on tape, so I can't say too much about Jeff at this stage. I'd love to tell you stories about Jeff, but that would not be appropriate on tape. But we've become good friends. Just let's say he's an amazing character. And you need to have enormous energy to relate to him. But he has a network of friends. The other key player is a man called Mario Beauregard, if you want it in English, who is at the University of Montreal, and the top researcher there on neuroscience. I mean, he was the one that pioneered the work on getting nuns to engage in meditation and then do the MRIs on their brains and see what difference it made. A very interesting character. And he wants to do other experiments that I'll not go into right now, but actually they're the silver bullet if they were to work. But we've decided to keep it low level. We don't want to burn down the house too quickly, but we want to get the option out on the table. But Beauregard is very, very interesting. B-E-A-U, Beauregard, or E-G-A-R-D, and he's a marvelous book out, I think, that's well worth. And then we've got top people out of China. Chinese are fascinated by these issues. And they come at it without any sort of like, well, let's look and see. Very interesting. So that's one element of the component. So we want the psychological material to be good. We want the neuroscience to be really good. Now that just then gets the data out on the table. The next question becomes, well, isn't that just correlation? Those who do science know exactly what that means. You know, we just get A following B, doesn't give us causation. That's where you have to have interesting philosophical work on the notion of agent causation. Now, I'll not bore you with the stuff on that. That's work, I've been working on that notion. It sounds like a very easy notion for about 40 years from when I was an undergraduate. And this work in Notre Dame that I've been doing related to divine agency has given me a wonderful time to just get after that. So this break has been fantastic as far as I'm concerned in getting both the time that we didn't start as early as we did in this project and the current research. So we want to look at this very interesting notion of agents being ontological entities that are not reducible to events and where they've got genuine powers. And that's a fascinating philosophical question. Goes all the way back to Aristotle and shows up in Scotland with Thomas Reid, shows up in the 20th century in various places. So that's a crucial component, and we need top-notch philosophers to work on that. Now, the really controversial and difficult part of this is how you relate this to quantum physics. I'll just confess up front, I'm out of my depth at that point. I have written, actually, a chapter in the current work on divine action and quantum physics. And I was telling someone earlier, I was trawling the literature. That's done and is put to bed for a first draft. But I was trawling the literature on this and found that the professor of physics at Oxford had written on theology and quantum physics. And I looked at his name and it said Paul Uritt. We were good friends back in Belfast in the late 60s. Could you believe this? No. And he's now one of the top physicists. And I can tell you, we're going to recruit him for this project. And I'll be meeting with him in May. But here's the issue as to where it relates to quantum physics. There's a phenomena in quantum physics, and if anybody knows more about this in the room, talk about it to us afterwards, in which there's the collapsed wave function. And it looks as if it's utterly indeterministic. That's to say, you don't know whether it's going to go this way or that way. Now, I've discovered there are 8 different interpretations of the collapse of the wave function, and 4 of them are non-deterministic, and 4 are. If you go with the non-deterministic account of that, what the analysis says is that the measurement, that's to say, human action, makes a difference to what happens in the collapse of the wave function. So what we're interested in pursuing is, suppose that we get the results that we're expecting, given the past record, that focused human attention can make a difference to the biochemistry of the brain. Would that, in fact, be compatible with or illuminated by, I like a soft term here, what goes on at the subatomic level? So we've got Henry Stapp, who's one of the great contemporary physicists to work on this. He's part of our team. We've also got an extraordinary young fellow from Princeton who is a philosopher of science and just all that, they work on all that stuff. So what we want to do is have folk work through that to see if that connection will develop. Now, beyond that, I'm interested in possibly bringing in some Buddhists just to make sure everybody's kept honest. Because Buddhists love neuroscience. Because it looks as if on certain readings of the neuroscience, there's no self. You know, it's an illusion. We can get Ben in on this one, actually, Ben Abito. And it's actually, that whole position was also developed by David Hume, a great Scottish philosopher in the 18th century. But I take a much more robust version of what it is to be a human agent. On the Buddhist version, the analogy for this would be like a rope. You know, you can take strands of hair and you can start making a rope. And as you develop the rope, you can stop off for the earlier part. So there's no continuous entity existing all the way through it. Because you keep adding sections of hair and you lop off all the sections over here, but you still got a rope that have got some kind of continuous existence. And if we keep our Buddhist on board, Templeton, I think, is asking questions as to whether we should go down that road. I would like to do this. We've got a wonderful chap from Bristol who's one of the leading sort of philosophers of Buddhism. And it would be great to see what he would do with that. What I'm interested in doing it is seeing whether, in fact, the notion of a human agent within the Christian tradition, in fact, is a one way to provide what you'd call the metaphysical music to really make sense of what's going on here. Now, note, as I mentioned in the original TEDx talk, I'm not interested in some sort of shotgun wedding between science and religion. I believe in God whether we get this right or not. That's another issue, a whole book on that topic, right? And I'm doing a whole other issue on the epistemology of theology, which will probably get out in the next 2 or 3 years. And so, I'm not going to lose my sleep at night if this doesn't work out. And I'm also, in some ways, this will be an enormous threat to the new atheists. I'm thinking of Dawkins and Hitchens, Hitchens and others. But I tend to take the view of John Wesley that, in fact, good atheism is a great gift to the church because it helps people to see there are serious options here. So I would start a fund for the new atheists because it would rattle all of the sort of lukewarm, half-baked, I don't know where I am Christians that are out there and really force them to take the Christian tradition seriously. That was Wesley's view of the issue of the 18th century, but that's just me. So what's at stake long-term on this ultimately is, in a sense, one level you could put it is our general common sense conception of ourselves correct? Because the material out of the neuroscience and the way that's being developed basically says that your common sense conviction that you exist as a genuine agent with real freedom, that actually is an illusion. So part of what's at stake here is what difference it makes to our conception of ourselves. And by the way, on that front, we've got an wonderful, I say extraordinary, that's an exaggeration. We have a wonderful psychologist, Jonathan Schuler, who's in California, and he's devised these amazing experiments where you tell people that they're determined, and you tell another group that they're not determined. And the group that they think they're determined will cheat more readily than those who do not. So there's not that we wouldn't have known that on the basis of just good observation to begin with, but there's a sense in which certain accounts of the human condition, I think, harm us. They lead us actually to have what I would consider to be a very low and inadequate account of the dignity and beauty and magnificence of what it is to be a human being. That's really where I think why this matters. But at the end of the day, what we're interested in is seeing whether the neuroscience at this stage will sustain that much more, what I'm interested in, that much more robust account of the human agent. But if it doesn't work out, we just go back into the lab and start again. And as I said on the text, on the talk, of course, if we're really wrong and you're just physics and chemistry and matter, it doesn't really matter. Because that's what we are, and we better just face up to it. And what we do with morality, what we do with truth, what we do with all sorts of other things, then you're going to have to sign up in the philosophy department and spend a lot of money to figure out what to do on the other side of that. There we are.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Natalie to grab the vase that we have for a door prize drawing and walk that around as we ask if anyone has a question for Dr. Abraham. And so, are there any questions about that?
I'm curious, with the advent of major significant scientific discovery, are we seeing a growing body of theologians taking, for instance, with the Bible and Christianity, taking a more metaphorical interpretation of Scripture as opposed to a literal?
Right. Answer, of course, is yes on that. But that didn't start in the modern period. It didn't start in the recent period. Thank you. The crucial texts at this stage are the early texts in Genesis. And the early fathers, many of the early fathers, like Origen and others, they did not take a literal reading of those texts. And we now know that, actually. And I love Aquinas on this. And he makes this point in terms of elephants' testicles. Very interesting topic. It shows the reference to elephant testicles shows up in the book of Job. Now, suppose that Scripture says one thing about elephant testicles, and you're a biologist and you discover other things about elephants' testicles, and they conflict with one another. He says, what do? You go with your observational account of it. And then you've got to reinterpret what the text says about these phenomena. Now, that's a very simple, that's a brilliant move, actually. It's been picked up by the Vatican, late 19th century, into Vatican II. Here's the common sense way of thinking why that is obvious. How we understand the literal and the metaphorical, in part, determines what we believe about the world. So if I say it's raining cats and dogs, you look out and say, I don't see any cats and dogs. You know immediately that that's metaphorical. Now, by the way, it would still be true even though it's metaphorical. This is why all of this is so interesting. Because it's true in the sense that you can translate that into, it's a Texas downpour. So the one use of metaphor is actually to state truth claims about the world. And a lot of people have thought if you go with metaphor, then you're no longer making truth claims. You're often a kind of la-la land of emotions or whatever. So to answer your question, absolutely, the contemporary work on particularly the Genesis material, both from the point of view of what we think these texts really meant in the original context. They're very sophisticated texts, actually. And in terms of what we now understand, how we understand the world of work, these are brought into harmony by saying, these people are not that stupid. If you read this like you're reading the Wall Street Journal, you're making a big mistake. And you need to do a retake on this material and see, in fact, what profound truths are being transmitted in and through this material. And that's why I love these texts. These texts are not for the faint-hearted. They're really great texts. That answer your question? Yeah. Over here. Yeah, the central hypothesis of the neuroscientists, which I'm interested in, is that human action changes the biochemistry of the brain. That's the hypothesis. Now, sustaining that is the tricky part, because the causal claims that are involved in that, making sure that you've got independent variables in both cases, and so on, that's all got to be in play. But that's the fundamental hypothesis that's at stake here in this work. And then once you lay that on the table, there's a whole network of philosophical and other questions that arise. And I have to say, it's those other sorts of questions that really interest me. But that's the fundamental hypothesis that's on the table. Good. Do you want to control the flow here?
Diane?
Causally changes the biochemistry of the brain.
And I'm so sorry, Martha's friend of Karen. Karen, sorry.
One of the things I've been reading about a lot recently is mirror neurons.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you've been looking at that at all, because to me, everything I've read about that suggests exactly what you're saying, which is the power and agency to alter.
Right. I've just stumbled into this in the last 3 months. And if you want to read people who are working on the relationship between that and theology, get a hold of Eleanor Stump, who is at the University of St. Louis, and her delightful son-in-law, a fellow called Adam Green. Now, just to bring you to, if I get this wrong, you help me, right? The motor neurons are a part of the brain in which you have dyadic or triadic attention. Yeah. Suppose you have a baby, and the baby looks at a ball, and you look at the ball with the baby. And you have a sense that you actually are aware not just of the ball, but of the other person looking at the ball. And you looking at the ball. That's the triadic. The dyadic is when you're in love and looking into their eyes. you know, all of that gooey stuff comes out. That's where you look into the eyes of the baby. And it's not just that you're aware of the physics, the eyes of the other person. You're aware that they're aware of your awareness, and so on. So this is, and the experimental base behind that is amazing. It's really, and how this develops in children. And then it's very relevant for issues like autism. Because in fact, what's happening in autism is that that component is not present. Now, of course, the crucial philosophical question is, what's the relationship between the awareness and the motor neurons? And that raises just fascinating questions about, can you reduce it to the motor neurons? Is it instantiated and made manifest in, with, and through the motor neurons or whatever? But this is turning out actually to be a very interesting issue in understanding religious experience. Because certain kinds of experience are experiences in which you are aware, this is the reports of them, you're aware of God's awareness of you. You're aware of what God really thinks about you. Most of the time, God leaves us alone and we just, you know, get through life. But if you're a Methodist, by the way, this is a big deal because of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. Because the heart of Methodism was the deep conviction that you can be aware, personally, subjectively, of God's love directed towards you. So you're aware of God's awareness you're aware of God's awareness of goodwill towards you. That's the way I put it. So that's being pursued in interesting ways. And Eleanor Stump, she's an extraordinary book called The Problem of Suffering. It's her Gifford Lectures. And she's been the pioneer in terms of exploring the relationship of this to theology. And to take your point more directly, of course, what it does is then it gives this rich description of what it is to be a human agent. See, I think human agents are the most extraordinary truth-detecting mechanisms, organisms rather. I mean, we're even better than thermometers. I mean, a thermometer will tell you what's going on in the room. And we have got this, you know, the old rationalist system that the Enlightenment in part, the European version of the Enlightenment said, you don't know anything unless you've got a proposition and you can show evidence for it. And that had a long innings until actually much of the mid-20th century. But the alternative to this is that in fact, human agents are these extraordinary knowing animals. We're these truth-detecting organisms. And you know that there are people who are aware of what's going on in the meeting, and others who are completely blind as bats. You ever been there? I mean, the narcissistic ones have no clue what's happening, because all they think about is themselves. But you're not making a kind of calculation. All right, in circumstances C, when these things are happening, I can make the inference, you know, that the dean is not feeling very well today, and he's under pressure because of Abraham's making a nasty argument about what he's been up to, right? That's not what's going on there. You know directly, immediately, what's happening here. And that's why this is relevant to the whole question of human agency, and I think profoundly relevant to philosophical questions and what's known as epistemology. And that's a whole other world, but you're absolutely on the money there. Yes, indeed.